Hey there, good morning, everyone. I'm Errol Barnett in for Vladimir Duthier at this moment. As you know by now, we're gathering updates on all the big stories happening in the U.S. and around the world. But we begin with breaking news on Capitol Hill. We're still waiting for a budget vote on what is President Trump's cornerstone domestic agenda priority. You're looking at live images now of House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. He has been speaking for more than 5 hours by this point. After the bill cleared a procedural hurdle in the overnight hours, Jeffries is using what's called a magic minute, and he's really slamming this so-called big, beautiful budget bill. And he's saying this is a matter of life and death for the American people. Take a listen.
People will die. Tens of thousands, perhaps year after year after year, as a result of the Republican assault on the health care of the American people. I'm sad. I never thought that I'd be on the House floor saying that this is a crime scene. And House Democrats want no part of it. No part of it.
Not mincing words there, CBS News congressional correspondent Nikole Killion is watching all of this unfold. Good morning again to you, Nikole. You know, another aspect of what Minority Leader Jeffries said is that he will, quote, take his sweet time on behalf of the American people to complain about this bill. But help us understand why he's taking so much time.
Well, this is a procedural tool that leaders have in moments like this. It's not uncommon or unusual. I would point out that back in 2021, we saw his predecessor, former House Speaker and former Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy, use a magic minute where he broke the record, holding the floor for about 8.5 hours in protest of President Biden's Build Back Better bill. So another BBB bill, not the big, beautiful bill, but Build Back Better. And so, look, this is what sometimes they do in the minority as a delaying tactic to try to slow the bill down. Of course, Republicans have had their own issues in terms of moving this vote forward, as you mentioned, just in terms of clearing some procedural hurdles overnight. You know, at one point yesterday, they held one procedural vote open for upwards of 7 hours, which also, to our understanding, may be a record. So from that standpoint, you know, just like we saw in the Senate, this is kind of a very long, hard slog to try to get this bill to the president's desk by his July 4th deadline.
And if you've explained over the past few weeks, Nikole, the House passed its version weeks ago by a vote. It passed through the Senate thanks to a tie-breaking vote from the vice president. Now it's back to the House after overnight procedural votes and holdouts being encouraged by President Trump to fall in line. And so now we expect this to pass after Jeffries' marathon. If that does happen, how will this change the lives of some of our viewers?
Yeah, well, obviously, I would hedge a little bit there just because we don't know how everyone is going to vote. Obviously, yes, it is assumed that it would likely pass, but I would point out that, you know, there were a number of members who had a lot of reservations about this bill and continue to do so. That's in part why it took some of these procedural votes so long to occur. And it's not just conservatives, but also moderates who have some reservations. Look, you know, in terms of some of the issues that conservatives have, keeping in mind many of them and some moderate members did meet just yesterday with the president at the White House. You know, their biggest issue was a lot of the changes in the Senate bill that, you know, it adds too much to the national debt. You know, it's about $1 trillion more than what the House sent over. Certainly many conservatives were concerned about some of the green energy tax credits that were rolled back. The Senate rolled back some, but the House conservatives wanted them to go farther on that. So there were discussions with the White House around that. You know, in terms of moderates and their concerns, you know, some of the changes that the Senate made to issues like what's known as a provider tax, which addresses and deals with how states fund their Medicaid programs, also cause some potential issues. So again, we'll just kind of have to see what people decide when that moment comes.
I think it would be remarkable if Jeffries was able to convince those last Republican holdouts to not support the bill, you know, if it is to eventually fail. We don't know with any certainty what will happen yet. But Nikole, we know we'll cross to you as soon as we have more information. Thank you so much. Now we want to jump over and bring in Juliegrace Brufke. She covers Capitol Hill for 24 Site News and can also help us understand what's happening where you are. One of the main criticisms coming from Minority Leader Jeffries is that there was just 15 minutes of debate allotted for this bill. And he said that was outrageous for the House Speaker to only give 15 minutes. Is that normal? Is that typical?
Well, there's typically provided some more time for debate for both parties there. But with this July 4th deadline that Republicans are angling for, Republicans are kind of trying to roll that and have spent a lot of their time kind of arm twisting their holdouts. So he's using his magic minute now to rail against the bill, hoping that that might flip some minds. But I just spoke with some members of Republican leadership, and they're feeling good about where they stand right now.
So Republican leadership feels good about this, but they did still, up until last night into the early hours this morning, have to convince some of the few holdouts to fall in line. President Trump even inviting some of them to the White House. It'd be fascinating to know what was discussed in the Oval Office as the president says, get behind this. So why aren't Republicans unanimous on this? Because it is, as I've said, a cornerstone of what the president wants.
So there has been no shortage of chaos and sleep deprivation as leadership in the White House have tried to get these members on board. And conservatives had some real concerns about the debt and deficit and its impact there. And I mean, it's kind of miraculous they were able to flip some of these Freedom Caucus members who were releasing memos railing against it and its effect on the economy, potential effect on the economy, I should say. But that being said, Brian Fitzpatrick was ultimately ended up being the only Republican to vote against the procedural vote last night. And he's in a left-leaning district. And there's definitely some concerns about the impact on Medicaid there. But leaders are feeling like they've got most of their members on board and feel like they'll pass it before the 4th of July.
And from your perspective, since you mentioned a left-leaning district, how will the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, which is a food assistance program for lower-income people, hit people in rural areas in red counties and red states?
Now, there were definitely some concerns about how things would impact rural hospitals, and Democrats have been railing against it, saying it's dangerous. Now, I talked to multiple Republicans just ahead of this TV hit that said that it's fear-mongering, that it's just getting undocumented immigrants off of Medicaid and people that don't belong on it. So ultimately, we'll see how the policy pans out there, but both sides are very adamant in where they stand on that.
Yeah, the House Speaker has said this is about getting rid of waste, fraud and abuse on the Medicaid system. Juliegrace Brufke, great to get your insight and your up-to-the-minute information with your sources there. We appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Now we want to jump over to CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. Willie James, you continue to get new information from the White House. President Trump wants to see this happen. He's been sending messages in the past day telling Republicans to fall in line. Help us understand how he's putting pressure to get this done.
Yeah, that's right, Errol. Part of the pressure campaign was not only hosting an event to highlight some of what this bill would accomplish just days ago here at the White House, but there's been a behind-the-scenes campaign to get members of Congress to support this bill, as you mentioned there, in-person meetings, phone conversations, and also the president posting on Truth Social. He posted this just moments ago. He said what a great night it was, one of the most consequential bills ever. The USA is the hottest country in the world by far. And of course, this follows other posts by the President of the United States to really compel Republicans to support this bill. The president alluding to voters watching closely, and that somehow if Republicans vote against this legislation, that could diminish their chances of winning a primary race or in fact re-election after that next year when we see the midterms happen. But this president has really turned up the heat, so to speak, in terms of pushing back against those who come out in opposition of this bill. We saw, of course, over the weekend, the president pushed back against Senator Thom Tillis, for instance, Senator Rand Paul, who both voted against that piece of legislation in the Senate. Of course, that eventually passed by a vote by the vice president, making the tie-breaking vote. But this president really wants to see this this first legislative accomplishment, the first major legislative accomplishment of his second term, succeed. And that's why you've seen him come out in force, at least publicly and privately, to compel Republicans to support this bill.
Yeah, and we'll continue to watch what's happening on the House floor closely in the minutes and hours ahead, so our viewers should stay close for that. But I want to ask you about another headline we're learning, and that's that President Trump says he will speak to Russian President Vladimir Putin perhaps this hour ahead of a conversation between himself and Volodymyr Zelensky scheduled for tomorrow, according to our Margaret Brennan. Help us understand what this could be in relation to.
Yeah, that's right. We have, of course, seen the president speak with both Zelensky and President Putin of Russia to try to negotiate some type of agreement between the two nations who, of course, have been at war for years now. The president likely hinting at this conversation. Of course, it takes place, as you mentioned, a day before the conversation with Zelensky. But it comes at an interesting time when the U.S. has essentially paused at least some weapons shipments to Ukraine. Part of the reasoning behind that is because the U.S. is not only reviewing those weapons shipments to different countries around the world, but that, as one U.S. official puts it, U.S. military stockpiles are falling too low. We, of course, know that this president wants to be the negotiator in chief, succeeding in negotiating peace between Israel and Iran, at least a ceasefire for now, helping to negotiate the exchange of hostages between Israel and Hamas, and now this other task to negotiate peace, potential peace between Ukraine and Russia. We, of course, know that that hasn't happened just yet. The president, before he became president during his second term, alluded that he could end this war quickly. That certainly hasn't happened. But this conversation, we await a readout from the White House or from the president himself. He oftentimes will post about the conversation he had. I'll note previous conversations have touched on a range of issues, not just a Ukraine and Russia war, but the situation in the Middle East as well.
That's right, and it's always important to compare what the president and the White House says about how those conversations went and with how their counterparts also do the same, in this case, the Kremlin with Russian President Vladimir Putin. All right, Willie James, we'll connect with you again when there's more information on that front. Thank you so much.